Recently, the Institute for Enterprise Ethics hosted a group of senior executives and independent directors for a roundtable breakfast discussion on the topic, the ethics discussion in the boardroom. Corporate Governance Magazine, a publication of Deloitte Development, LLC, has written, quote, effective boards help set the ethical tone for the entire organization and actively participate in programs designed to promote appropriate behavior with regard to compliance, integrity, and ethics. If, as Deloitte says, ethics is such an important element in a board's effectiveness, why are frank discussions of the topic such a rarity in corporate boardrooms? In fact, it seems that unless a board is facing an ethical crisis situation, or it's time to reapprove the corporation's code of conduct, the ethics discussion never occurs. Why is this, and how can we change such a situation? The roundtable breakfast discussion was led by Mr. Bill Heck, the president of the Colorado chapter of the National Association of Corporate Directors. Bill is also the managing partner of the Harlan Group, advisors to independent directors and senior executives on board and governance issues. Here is Bill's opening comments for the discussion.
I would like to frame the discussion with saying that this is not a topic about compliance. It's not a topic about meeting the requirements that the SEC or the exchanges impose on us for managing compliance, both at the board level and the organization level. What I'd like to do is ask that this conversation this morning be about how we as board members and those who influence board members have conversations around ethics, as Dan was mentioning. Not the consequences thereof, and not the theology related to, but the literal conversations about drawing out conversations of ethical standards and ethical guidelines. So those of you who don't want to get that deep into the conversation, you're excused right now to leave. Those of you who want to stay and try to get into that conversation, Dan and I welcome you to stay. I'd like to try to set up the conversation such that I add to your knowledge a little bit, not much, but a little bit, because around this room there are experts far greater in this area of ethics than I will ever be, from varying and different angles. The value of gathering this group together this morning is just that, is that we have varying and different angles on the topic of ethics. That is, ethical discussions in the boardroom. So what I'm going to spend a couple of minutes doing is giving you some additional information, whether it's right or wrong, don't judge me on that, that hopefully will stir some thinking on your part about issues around bringing up discussions and dealing with and managing potentially discussions around ethics. You did have the chance of getting some materials beforehand. I am certain that nobody read any of it because that's the pattern. It normally is the case. I would encourage you after today, though, if you see some of the material that you would like to delve deeper into, I would recommend that you do that. There is one piece in the package, though, that I would like to draw your attention to, and it's a piece that was recently done by McCladrey along with NACD that talks about the C-suite expectations, and it talks about those expectations from the C-suite officer's point of view. On page 10, I believe, I don't have the full copy here, there was a discussion around the ethics officer in the corporate staff. I think that's important to understand and realize. I think it's also important to understand and realize that one of the more recent initiatives on the part of National Association of Corporate Directors is to ask and answer the question, where is the air traffic controller around risk and around ethics on your board? And we can come up with some great recent examples of that air traffic controller not being there. So when I ask the question of a board, who in this board, either by committee assignment or by person, is most responsible or singularly responsible for ethics? And the answer I get back is everybody's responsible for ethics. I say to myself very quietly, we're in trouble. Much like we have in today's world of team management, when we gather a team together and we say we're going to do this as a team and we're going to involve a team, and all the decisions are going to be made democratically, you get the response from the team members under their breath oftentimes, he or she has got to be crazy. We need somebody up front who's making the decisions, who's actually taking the arrows, interestingly enough. And so in the matter of ethics, that might be the case. So you also received in your package an outline. And the outline had broken down, hopefully, you received the outline, broken down into assumptions, broken down into a little bit of lecture on my part, but most importantly, broken down into 3 questions that I'll pose this morning. And the expectation on my side of the podium is that most of the conversation will be on that side of the podium, not this side. So be prepared to argue, be prepared to propose, be prepared to tell stories, but most importantly, be prepared to learn, hopefully from those who are sitting around the table with you. So the assumptions that I'm operating on this morning are these. Ethics is an underlying competency required of directors as they review, digest, understand, and provide advice on the full spectrum of company matters. Ethics is an underlying competency. So on your proxy statements, you recall, you now are putting your skills matrix up, right? If you aren't, you might want to think about doing that. If you're not, don't worry about it because it's not a requirement. But in that skills matrix, recall, in terms of directors, you have functional skills, and you probably have industry skills listed for your participation as a director on the board. Wouldn't it be interesting if we had competency skills and ethics was on that matrix and it was in the proxy and you as a board member were given grades on that matrix of how well you're handling ethics at the board level? I just put that out as an example and as a scenario in my definition of what the definition of a competency might look like. The second assumption is ethics is not treated in an organizational manner by directors in the same way as risk and strategy, going to Dan's point, are treated, nor in a process manner in the same way information gathering and reporting and decision processes are treated. So in your decision process that you have in your board book and in your board activities, is there a stop along that decision process where the question is asked, is my review and is my definition of the answer to this problem or my contribution to the answer to this problem ethically correct? A stop along the decision path where physically, openly, in discussion or individually in your own mind and in your own heart, you're asked to ask and answer the question, is this adequate in meeting the ethical standards that I have committed to or that the board is committed to? The third assumption is ethics appears in the realm of board governance as a given. We're all ethical, aren't we? That receives little formal and direct attention on board agendas and anecdotal education, anecdotal attention in board education. So, recall the last board education you had where you assembled either off-site or you assembled in the boardroom and an outside facilitator or an inside facilitator provided education. Was there in the last 10 years a topic that delved into ethics and forming ethical standards and complying with ethical standards from the heart and the mind? Don't know. Interesting question. The fourth assumption is for this morning, public attention to ethics ebbs and flows as institutional decisions are recorded at the margin, with the lack of ethics being the major takeaway that is left for interpretation and discussion. So, Mr. Skilling asked the federal sentencing group, can I get off early? We're still hashing the conversations that Mr. Skilling had while that organization was under the microscope. And most of those conversations, aren't they, are around the foundation of ethics. I don't know. I don't know. When it comes time to, in the boardroom, suggest that there are a number of off-book activities going on that are profitable, yet are interestingly positioned in ethics, you wonder how those conversations occur. But more importantly, in my mind, I wonder how long has it been since Mr. Skilling read the rules that he was heading off to prison. We're still talking about that, and I think we're talking about it within the foundations of ethics. So I'm going to have a little bit of a discussion with you on a didactic level. I want to make sure that I am understood completely. I am not a business ethicist. I am not a faculty member. I would never want to be a faculty member. I am simply a person with a lot of experience, and I have a good deal of empathy and interest in ethics. There is a gentleman who a number of us in this room are familiar with, Howard Carver. Howard is an individual who has taken it upon himself in his director years that he's in after having been with E&Y for about 35 years, the topic of ethics. And he is attacking that topic, addressing that topic in the classroom. He's actually taken on the mantle of a faculty professor. Thank heaven somebody has from the business world. I'm sorry, Dennis, but that had to be said. And he is
here to take those arrows.
And he is having discussions at the University of Wisconsin, Minnesota, somewhere, in the classroom, and I applaud him for doing that. And I would recommend that if any of you have that interest, you should do that also. So, let me go to that material, if I can find it here, and we'll have some discussion around the didactics of the process. Gosh, even if I brought that material, I should have it right here. What I'd like to do is break the conversation down into three areas this morning, and then I'll open up the questions as we have seen them on the agenda. So, and this is in an attempt to exercise interest on the topic, and it's not an attempt to try to solve, and it's not an attempt to try to tell you that I know more than you. By any means, I don't. But it is an attempt to ask the question, if I were a director and I were worried about ethics and I had as a requirement in my director fellowship program a responsibility and accountability to go out and identify areas where I could go to and identify the nexus of ethics that I could learn from and adapt in my own behavior and try to impart that to my fellow directors, where would I go? I asked that question of myself, and I ended up with three areas or buckets that I would go to. I ended up with religion and academia, I ended up with corporate law, and I ended up with the health profession. And the reason I ended up with that is because in my experiences for the last 85 years, I've had an opportunity to think about where would the final answer or the most complete answer come from in various topics. And thinking about ethics, those are the three that first came to my mind. And so I went there and I looked. As you would expect I would do, I did on a very sophomoric basis. But let me walk through this for a moment. So on religion and academia, and let me say parenthetically that you also in your package received the materials that we sent you. And a good deal of those materials were based around the topic of how is ethics, business ethics, being treated in the classroom in MBA programs. And so in this world of looking into religion and academia, that sort of was a precursor to these conversations. So in that world, I discovered that the relationship between revelation and reason, the difference is inherent in a discussion of natural law theory and a humanistic perspective based on tenets of reason. That is, anything that is not rationally verifiable cannot be considered justifiable. So natural law theory derives from the basis that we would do well acting according to God's design or purpose for our lives. And from these two perspectives, revelation and reason, we have each called upon conclusions that are, and I'm speaking to us now, that our ethics are shaped from our understandings and beliefs in Judeo-Christian teachings that provide us guardrails based on teachings in the commandments, beatitudes, and psalms, while providing us a parallel universe with principles that are upheld for their value in promoting independent and responsible individuals. So there's been some translation in our minds from that Judeo-Christian teachings that we've had and applying that to that parallel universe of reason that we find in the business world that we try to make some sense out of on a daily basis. That could translate into ethics, ethical standards, and ethical guardrails. Our foundations, and I'm speaking to all of us around here using me as a proxy, even though I'm much older than anybody else in the room, our foundations for consideration of these parallel universes that don't have the same source started with a tension that if we didn't create a common dictionary to handle both universes, that is the revelation and the reason universe, we would not be effective as leaders. In other words, if we can't articulate our definition of those parallel universes, we would not be in a winning condition. Aristotle thought through for us common language to do just that. He teaches us that cultivating qualities of virtues like prudence, reason, accommodation, compromise, moderation, wisdom, honesty, and truthfulness, where have we heard those? Starting with our graduate programs. Among many virtues, enable us to enter the discussions and conflicts between revelation and reason. Have you worried about that before in your life? That is, your definition of revelation and your definition of reason, and how close do they come together on a parallel scheme? Universities continue to deal with the tension and balance between revelation and reason. A recent Zogby poll of 2012 college seniors found that nearly 75% said their professors taught that what is right and wrong depends on differences in individual values and cultural diversity, with a quarter, 25%, saying that there are clear standards of right and wrong by which everyone is judged. Thank heavens that's not reversed. When asked which profession most had anything goes approach that leads to success, and anything goes approach, which professions do you think those Zogby poll answers said? About 28% of them answered business, with journalism and law in second and third most frequent response. An anything goes attitude, which is why we're around the table talking about the ethical discussions in the boardroom. So apparently we continue to shape and reshape our understanding of that balanced tension between revelation and reason. When considering ethics in our discussions and decisions, don't know if we do or not, I leave that for you to think about. The second area that I went to was corporate law, since all of us have to abide by that. Some of us less than others, no less, not right. Those of you with law school backgrounds will recall the hours you spent reading and discussing legal standards in comparison to ethical standards. Yet another balance with tension. Some of these discussions centered around learning of the origin and application of the business judgment rule. A common rule that we all know as directors, and a common rule that we all know, I not as a lawyer, but you who are from the profession of law. The directors and officers of a corporation are responsible for managing and directing the business and affairs of the corporation. So reads the law of business, the business judgment rule. They often face difficult questions concerning whether to acquire other businesses, sell assets, expand into other business areas, etc. They may also face potential hostile takeovers by other businesses. To help directors and officers meet these challenges without fear of liability, famous last words, courts have given substantial deference in decisions the directors and officers must make. Under the business judgment rule, just to remind us all, the officers and directors of a corporation are immune from liability to the corporation for losses incurred in corporate transactions within their authority, so long as the transactions are made in good faith and with reasonable skill and prudence. We have learned, both personally and academically, and around the table reading the Wall Street Journal, that despite the seemingly broad scope of the business judgment rule, corporate directors have not always been able to rely upon it as a way to escape liability for their actions. Aha! Final last word. And I've got a couple of quotes, but I won't bore you with those quotes, in the sense that it is a slippery slope to deal with in terms of corporate law and the business judgment rules. So the question there is that the nexus or the key or the holy grail for measuring ethics and standards of ethical standards and guardrails of ethics relative to decisions around elements regarding corporate law? Should we only use, and can we only use, and should we only think about using the business judgment rule in that regard? The third area that I went to, in terms of looking for any help that I could get in terms of answering the questions I asked about ethics, was the practice of medicine. I'm not going to ask you if I've made the right choices, where to go to pick up information around ethics, to start adding to your knowledge and getting the juices flowing this morning. I'll simply say that in my own construct, in my own experience, these are the three areas that I found most comfortable to go to frame the discussion for this morning. So the prospect of practicing under the Hippocratic Oath of first do no harm has been described as a balance in making life, death, and quality of life decisions that has, in more remote ways, as the practice of medicine evolves, a basis in ethics. Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, does it or does it not have a foundation in ethics? Good question. Balancing the understanding of ethics with the exigencies of, for example, acute and palliative care. So we're in a world right now where costs of care are being discussed at the insurance level as well as the provider level. And we're at a point in our lives right now where we're hearing more discussion around and more justification around palliative care versus acute care. Interesting prospect. When faced with a decision of whether or not you encourage the physician who is consulting with you to go down the route of acute care or curative care, or to agree with the physician and encourage the physician to go down the route of palliative care, how much of that discussion involves ethical standards or ethical guardrails? The practice of medicine throughout specialties and types of care, from pediatric to pharmaceutical care, has struggled most recently with the ethics of the method of reimbursing care. A recent New York Times article highlighted results from a Boston consulting group, Harvard School of Medicine study, finding that hospitals potentially make money from their own mistakes based on insurers paying hospitals for longer stays and extra care of patients or treatment of surgical complications. The perverse nature of reimbursement of services provided continually presents physicians and other caregivers with the ethical dilemma of prescribing and directing care without regard to the coding tables that drive levels of reimbursement for public and private insurers or payers. Is that ethics? And if we delve into the practice of medicine, both on the provider side as well as the research side, and we look for answers to the application of ethical standards or the answers to development of ethical standards, would we be going down a rabbit's hole or not? Interesting question. The medical community treats ethics officially as proscriptive. That is, it prescribed to be given and followed. AMA Code of Ethics, the medical profession has long subscribed to a body of ethical statements developed primarily to the benefit of the patient. A physician shall be dedicated to providing competent medical care, and a physician shall uphold the standards of professionalism, be honest in all professional interactions, and strive to report physicians deficient in character or competencies or engaging in fraud or deception. So there is such a thing as the AMA Code of Ethics. It is proscriptive, and does it or does it not deal with or start the discussion around how do I have an ethical discussion with my colleagues? How do I have an ethical discussion with my clients, the patients? And how do I have, most importantly, an ethical discussion with myself? So That's a little bit of knowledge that I just imparted, very little bit of knowledge. Let's talk about, in practical terms, about the ethics discussion in the boardroom. So let's start the conversation off with, and I'll accept with a long silence, I'm sure, anybody's entry into this conversation. Should ethics be proscriptive in nature? That is, should they act as specific rules that tie morality to practicality, or tie those two universes of relevance and reason together? Should ethics in the director world be proscriptive? As an example, be proscriptive to the level where, on an annual basis, a director attests to, or an outside third party attests to, the level of ethics that that particular director has, with a tool that asks questions around the proscriptive nature of upholding those ethics. That is, how well is that person meeting the standard?